Number one is you try to center your parachute, right? And by center, I mean make sure the roll axis is over your head. You stop any turn before it evolves. And of course, that's more than one option. But ultimately, I find like if you're hanging equally on each riser group, and one side of the parachute goes away, it does this. So it
Uh-huh.
causes a harness turn. But at the same time, that collapse causes a lot of drag on that side of the parachute as well. So it wants to go not only into a roll, but also surge forward to a low angle of attack where the canopy's in front of you and it drops really quick. And so you got to lean on the good side. That's the way I think of it is, if my right side goes away, it's natural to want to try to pump out the collapsed side, and that natural instinct will get you killed because it's going to cause the turn to go faster. So instead, you lean the other way pretty aggressively, rolling your hips into an opposing harness turn, and that alone will usually stop the turn and recover the wing. It may then dive, right? It's like if it's sort of held into this funny configuration that's rotating the yaw because of all the drag on one side, and the wing is trying to kind of, it pulls back that side up and back. As soon as the wing recovers from this input, it wants to sort of surge for more airspeed. It's collecting it. And so you have to be ready to check that surge. When the canopy tries to go in front of you, you hit those brakes sharply and just put the wing back over your head. So initially you're centering with respect to roll and yaw, and then once it recovers, you're prepared to stop the pitch surge that's normal after the recovery happens. It's possible that if you take an asymmetric collapse like that and you give harness input, it may not be enough. And so you might have to come in with opposite toggle to hold the parachute on a heading, especially on parachutes that don't have a lot of harness power. In other words, like a rectangle, a canopy like a reserve or something like that. It really doesn't give a lot of harness turn. You lean into it, it just barely rotates, which means that you don't have the power to stop a rotation that's caused by a deflation. So be prepared to use a steering toggle also, and do it enough, but not too much. You know what I mean? If it's the right side that goes, you initially want to have the instincts of your body leaning to the good side of the parachute, but then you oppose with the other toggle if necessary, but not so much that you actually cause it to rotate the other way, or worse yet, stall the remaining part of the parachute, because you don't have much time at 50 to 100 feet. You need that thing to recover and start its recovery process. And just like with a stall recovery, you can't just let your hands up and let it go through its normal pitch oscillation. They call flight cycle. The pitch
Mm-hmm.
oscillation, the natural, it gets like extra airspeed, which causes it to level off, and then it slows down because the parachute now goes behind you from the flaring effect as a result of the high airspeed, making the canopy go back, and then it slows down, and then it wants to surge again, and then it wants to go through yet another one of those. And your job is to do the opposite of what the canopy's doing. So if the canopy wants to go in front of you, you go no. The canopy goes behind you, you go yes. Hands up. So there's this kind of playing with the brakes deliberately to center the wing, and that's something you can practice. Up high, you just apply brakes in a flare, and then you make the canopy surge, and then deliberately try to dampen those oscillations. The sine wave, if you will. Everything is really a sine wave. The canopy, goes behind you in the initial flare. You come off, it dives, and you stop the thing aggressively, but at the same time, you're kind of doing this in opposition to what you're feeling. And I think it's a great idea to play with these pitch dampening motions we call active pitch control with your eyes closed. When you're up high, you scan for traffic, and then you play around with the amount of brakes to make that parachute settle out, sort of calm down sooner. And you do it by load factor, and also the middle ear will tell you kind of where the canopy is. But to be able to sense that, especially down low, is very important. You don't have time at 50 to 100 feet when you've taken a collapse to look up at your parachute and figure out what's wrong with it. You need the evidence based on what you see, so I'm seeing a lot of green. Okay, well, that's probably a symmetrical collapse of some kind, or a surge from getting behind the trees or something, the turbulence, the downdrafts. And if it's rotating to the right, I know it's the right side that went away. Bottom line is, I don't care what it looks like. If it's turning to the right, I have to do something that turns to the left, to stop it and hold its heading. And then as soon as it starts to fly straight again on its own, you'll notice as the recovery occurs, it makes a noise. The actual collapses are usually silent. The recoveries are loud. The wing will actually make this snapping noise, and you hear this rush of the fabrics are getting snapped, and the airflow getting back into the wing to pressurize everything. That makes a little sound. And it's also an indication that things haven't settled out yet, so you're going to have to do things actively to center yourself on the pitch axis once you've stopped the turn. But priority number one is stop the turn of the parachute, get it under control. There's obviously some things that you can't plan for, that it's complicated situations, but most of the time you're only dealing with full frontal collapse, asymmetrical collapse, right, where it actually wants to turn. And then on occasion, you do sometimes see what starts looking like a full frontal, but just the center cell collapses. We call that a fortune cookie. It may not go all the way to a full fortune cookie where your end cell, but it's kind of sort of trying to. So whether it's a symmetrical full frontal or a symmetrical fortune cookie, it holds a heading and it wants to dive at the ground, and your job is to spike those brakes sharply, not all the way, just enough so that you feel the line tension come back, you feel the lift come back. That's going to be indicated by the weight increase. And when you spike those brakes, you're not only increasing the drag of the airfoil to keep it, sort of above your head and slightly behind, but you're also helping the situation by pinching the airfoil at the back, because anytime you pull the brakes down, you're reducing the volume of the back of the parachute, right? Aft of the C lines collapses as you pull down on those tail points. And when you squeeze the tail, you squirt the air inside the wing forward. And so if you've got that frontal fortune cookie, it pops out. If you got the full frontal where the A lines go down and sort of under the canopy, it'll just pop it right out.
I've never heard it explained that way. That makes sense though. When you're pulling out in the back, you force air forward. Yeah.
If you reduce the volume at the back, that air has to go somewhere.
Yeah,
right?
That makes sense.
You remember Boyle's law? P1 V1 equals P2 V2. Pressure and volume. Those are the two things. Mm-hmm. And so the relationship of pressure and volume is a constant. It's a fraction that will always work out to be the same thing. It's just on one side of the equation, you might have a larger volume and a lower pressure. And on the other side of the equation, you might have a smaller volume, like a squeezed balloon, that will now have a higher pressure inside of it. But it's all trying to achieve a balance, a homeostasis. So all of this is about Boyle's law. And so you're the intelligence behind Boyle's law in this case.
I was thinking about if I'm flying and I'm feeling that that is collapsing. Well, my collapse was. I'm thinking about my collapse. That was 20, 30 feet. I mean, I don't remember having 1 second to do anything. Yeah. I mean, I just remember it pushed me to the side, and next thing I'm on the ground. So it was just not. So, but let's say if I was higher.
I'm not. I think you still might have been able to fix it with this knowledge and with this rehearsal, because you didn't have it in your head. You didn't have it queued up as a response. Like this is queued up. You don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is that I witnessed one of the most perfect examples of how, even with a limited altitude, if you do the right thing, you can solve some pretty extreme problems. I mean, the guy came out of his hook turn just a little bit high, so he was at maybe 20 feet off the ground, not high at all, in level flight. So granted, that's kind of an unusual circumstance compared to yours, because he was going so fast and he was horizontal to the ground. But During the slowdown phase of that, of course, now the canopy naturally wants to gently surge forward. It's not as aggressive as this kind of a surge, but after you level out, the canopy naturally want to go down the hill. And as it does, the line loading reduces, right? As it does, the lift reduces, particularly the lift at the front of the parachute. And at that point, he took an asymmetric collapse. He immediately responded with an opposing harness and toggle input, kept the canopy from turning. He kept himself pretty much on a heading because he was so quick about it. And as soon as he stopped the turn and the wing recovered all on its own because he stopped his turn, the wing wanted to dive. And as soon as it started to dive, it did a full frontal. He whacked those brakes so sharply the nose popped out. He flared as a result of that and then landed softly on his feet. He collapsed his parachute, put it away, and I walked up to him like this. I want to shake your hand because that was freaking amazing. And he said, "Oh, yeah, you don't remember me. I didn't used to have the big bushy beard, but I took your canopy course a bunch of years ago, and I was thinking exactly what you taught me, and it worked."
That's awesome.
Even years later, it occurred to him to, number one, prioritize the heading, right? Stop the turn. Number two, be ready for that secondary surge and stop it from doing it. Even if the nose does go, you can still, put that parachute behind you where the nose wants to roll out and fly again. And it proof's in the pudding. It works.
So if, let's say, if it's turning and then you apply, like I said, you apply just one brake kind of sharp, that's not going to, that's, what about rear riser? Isn't rear riser also?
Not as good. Yeah, no, it's not as good. Actually, harness is by far the best. Yeah. As your instinct, it has to be your body as the priority. The rear riser front riser would be the worst thing you could do.
Sure.
Second worst would be a rear riser because it doesn't offer as much drag as a toggle does, right? So, in other words, if you pull down on a rear riser, you're not actually creating an edge to the back of the parachute to offer all that drag, and so it may not stop the turn quite as quickly, quite as well. Mm-hmm. And the third thing is that when you lean with your harness onto the good side, there is a roll axis manipulation happening that is very, very helpful. And picture those cross ports, right? The holes in your ribs. You've lost part of your parachute. It's folded under. It doesn't have the relative wind to, inhale from the leading edge of the wingtip. And so the only way you can get the air to that side of the wing is, number one, to increase the angle of attack. That can work. But you're going against a lot of relative wind force. And so a flare can help if you stop the turn, because if the turn itself is sliding you sideways into the collapse, you're going down the toilet bowl. So you're a turd getting flushed down the spiral, and the relative wind is coming from the side of your wing, holding it shut. But those cross ports work in your favor here, because if you lean aggressively to the other side of the parachute, the air rolls inside the wing, inside the volume, from the good side over to the bad side, and it just pops out.
I think I can make it now. The pain is gone. All of the bad feelings have disappeared. Here is that rainbow I've been praying for. It's gonna be bright.
Hello, I'm Brian Germain, and welcome to Taking on Turbulence. Adventure Wisdom's been creating a lot of videos, and I've realized that one of the most important topics that I needed to go into greater depth on is flying your canopy in turbulence. It's something that scares pretty much everybody, and the fact is that if it doesn't scare you, it's possible that you're not quite understanding the magnitude of the situation. The sky is a powerful place, and you're quite small in comparison to the forces that you're taking on. Parachutes have become very, very good, very, very stable over the years. However, there's limitations to any flight vehicle, and yours is no different. So when we consider the fear factor, if you will, about flying in turbulence, you kind of have to break it down into two main categories. So on one hand, we have the perceived risk. All right, so this is your emotional experience, which may be driven by a very sane reality, but if it's simply a perception that is not valid, it's important to recognize that case, because there's lots of folks that stand down from a jump that would be perfectly okay. Maybe their canopy would bounce around a little bit, but it wouldn't collapse, it wouldn't cause any problems. So you have to learn more about the topic, we all do, so that we can make a better judgment call and sort of separate that perceived risk from actual risk. And so what we're going to look into here is the actual risks and what we can do to reduce those risks, how to sort of isolate those variables and notice them. Maybe you'll be the first one in the drop zone to stand down. And as some wise people have said, the bravest person on the drop zone is the first one to scratch off the load, to take yourself off manifest when you just don't feel right about it. And then you validate that feeling with actual appraisal of your physical reality. And so when we take a closer look at this idea of actual risk, we have some variables that are beyond our control, that are just, the sky is bigger than you. When we talk about severe turbulence, it doesn't matter what you're flying, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're going to get hurt or possibly killed if you fly under those conditions. And some of those variables that are beyond your control are within reasonable limits. It's just you kind of have to swallow it. You have to accept the fact that, for instance, your canopy is going to bounce around and breathe in moderate turbulence. That's just the nature of parachuting. You're not flying a metal vehicle, and even if you were, you would still feel the increase and decrease in G's and the changes to your control inputs and the feeling in your body. And so if you have variables that are beyond your control that are within acceptable limits, then maybe you choose to fly anyway. And then you have variables that are within your control. And of course, your go or no-go is the number one, right? And so we all have to beware of hungry logbook syndrome, where you got to make that jump. Maybe you've been stuck in an office all week long. Maybe you haven't been able to jump for a while for weather reasons, and you're hungry. And you look at the conditions, and your perception is skewed based on your hungriness, right? Your desire. You're seeing through these rose-colored glasses that can lead you into bad situations. Some of the variables that are within your control are, once you've actually exited the aircraft, how do you fly and where do you fly? Can change the way your parachute responds to turbulence. There are certain things that you can do to substantially reduce your risks as you're flying any canopy, and certainly some parachutes are more stable than others. We'll get into those distinctions. But the bottom line is that a smart pilot that has learned instincts, right? So learned is the intellectual part, but trained is the physical rehearsal that leads you to have a quick response that is the right response.